enough of him, the story about Joseph Knight, a young man from Africa who was enslaved and bought by a planter called John Wedderburn, and whose life changed fundamentally when John Wedderburn decided to come back to Scotland. And from that point onwards, he began to ask questions about what freedom meant to his life and what his status was in this world. And underneath that, I guess it's a love story. It's a story about people of a lower class trying to sort of define their role in each other's lives and their role within a patriarchal household. Originally, I was aware of the Joseph Knight story when I was at law school. Um, I was really fascinated when I got to the end of my third year in law school, when I was writing my dissertation, looking at the archives for any visibility of Black people in Great Britain, certainly post-World War II. But it wasn't really until 2016 when the Brexit referendum was happening, around the same time when the National Theatre of Scotland asked me to come up with a play idea. And, really, I had this crystallizing moment watching the news, seeing a lot of people on the news saying things like, we want our country back. I felt like there was a lot of coded language in that phrase. There's a myth, I think, and there's a way we've taught ourselves of our own history that's sort of editorialized Black people out of our shared British history. And, I just felt like actually that we want our country back was speaking to that myth, this idea that Black people have only been part of the history of this country for a very short period of time. The story that we've told ourselves is that the Windrush shows up post-World War II. So, Black people have only been around 75 years or so. And everything before that, Britain and Scotland was white and Irish, English and Welsh and Scottish. And I had said to the National Theatre of Scotland that I really want to write plays that shine a light on the fact that Black people have been living in this country and contributing to this country politically, socially, economically, culturally for a lot longer than that. And so we came back to this story about Joseph Knight, who, I think, shifted the moral arc of justice that little bit towards all the things that we enjoy and appreciate about the society that we live in today. Consider myself a historical playwright, and the nature of the work of a historical playwright is part archival reconstruction and part creative invention. With a character like John Wedderburn, actually it's relatively straightforward telling a story like that because there's so much information in the archives about old white men. And when you try and tell the story of people like Joseph Knight, young Black men, working class Black men, and certainly women, in particular working class white women, and don't even get me started on the difficulties with the archives of trying to tell the stories of Black women and certainly working class Black women. Actually, in that moment, that's where all the heavy lifting of the research is. The reality is that there's lots of intersectional, racist and sexist issues with the archives because inevitably all the big professions, the journalists, the courtrooms, have been dominated by old white men. And actually what that really means is that the lives that are recorded in those archives tend to be the lives that particular class of people in that particular time of society deemed to be valuable. So I guess, in terms of the research with somebody like Annie Thompson, a working class white woman, we couldn't find anything about her actually, even in the church archives. So what we had to do was, look a lot broader and look at, what other women of the same class and the same status were doing and what we could find out about them at the same period of time and sort of build that into Annie's character. Joseph Knight's actually relatively easy in many respects to research about because of the courtroom document that comes out of the Court of Sessions. And one of the most interesting things that I discovered whilst researching this story was the lack of controversy, I would say, between interracial marriage in Scotland. We're very aware because of the way we've been taught of our history and because of the films that we've seen and the literature that we've been exposed to, what's going on in the United States of America at this same time. At this point in history, in the 1770s, if a black man was to look at a white woman too long or in the wrong way, he would be lynched. But actually, in this country, it was very different. You know, there was an almost church-like supremacy. You know, if the church was willing to baptize a person, the community wouldn't challenge that. You know, if the church was willing to marry two people, again, the community wouldn't challenge that. You know, I found that, you know, really fascinating, and it really did lead on to much more research in another play that I'm writing about later on about Frederick Douglass. It's taking place in the 1840s, where you begin to see that shift on a at least working class grassroots level in terms of when it became slightly more controversial for interracial marriage in Scottish society. And I mean, there's lots of little things like that as well. You know, this story's taking place just before the suffragist movement, let alone the suffragette movement. So actually, when you start looking at a character like Annie Thompson, you realise that in many respects, just like the Colliers of the day, she's to many degrees not free herself. And you know, the thing that I found what was really interesting about centering Joseph Knight's story and Annie Thompson's story, if you're talking about two people who aren't free, finding ways to speak to each other about this thing that I think is innate in all of us, which is a desire for freedom, a desire for independence and agency in our own lives. And you know, you look at something, you look at someone like Annie Thompson, and you realise that if this story was taking place in anywhere else other than the United Kingdom, the story would have a very, very different character. Annie Thompson can read, you know, she's had the parish education that everybody had in Scotland because of church policy. Now, if Annie Thompson, a working class white woman, if the story is taking place in England, I just don't see how Joseph Knight and Annie Thompson could have seen those parallels within each other. And the story would certainly have a very different characteristic. It all starts with character, you know, and you know, character sort of leads to action. The difference with a historical play is that, you know, through the archival reconstruction, you can learn things about the character. So you're not just creating it all up from absolutely nothing, and you might want to stick closely to those things. So, for example, you know, one of the things that we were really interested in is this idea that you know, good people do bad things and bad people do good things. You know, we didn't want to create, again, following those tropes, a bad guy that is impossibly bad that nobody can relate to. We didn't want to create a enslaved person that is a good guy that you know, has no faults, is impossibly perfect. That again, you know, nobody can relate to. You know, one of the things that jumps out of the Court of Session document about Joseph Knight is a lot of these arguments start off with an alleged feeling of crossness that his silk stockings were chafing him and weren't good enough. Now, like for me, again, I feel like that says something about his character, about his privilege. In any other context, you would not see somebody who's been enslaved talking about how irritated he is by the fact that his silk stockings aren't comfortable enough. You know, little things like that in some ways, you know, make your life a lot easier actually when it comes to, you know, sitting down and writing. But I think that, you know, if you were just, you know, if you were doing it from the ground up with something that was completely fiction without any kind of archival background, you would be doing the same things. You know, I've not always, you know, written history plays, so I feel like sometimes the reality of the way writers work is it's not so simple where characters come from. Sometimes they come because you're taking a part of yourself and you're giving it to a character. Sometimes you're taking a bit of somebody that you know. Sometimes there's somebody that you've read about in fiction or you've seen on the news or a celebrity or whatever, and that's how you sort of build characters. You almost like, you know, tease it out and figure it out. It's only that with a history play, I feel like there's an ethical duty to you know, where possible, lean into the facts of what we know about those characters. You know, this had quite a long development period, to be fair. So first and foremost, you know, I would sort of say Rosie Kelleher was, you know, lockstep with me all the way through the whole journey of the play, but certainly in the first sort of 3/4 of the play, it was mainly me and her. Rosie Kelleher is the dramaturg here at the National Theatre of Scotland. Yeah, in many respects, if this play is any good, it's not just because of me, it's because of her as well. As in, you know, every single decision, every single character, I feel like both of us have thrown big parts of ourselves into this story and its development. And if I had a different dramaturg, it would be a different play. Then there was a workshop quite early on as well with Helen Mackay and Charlene Boyd and a few other lovely actors, where I think we took about a fourth or fifth draft and we just pulled every scene apart. And again, that was a process of me rewriting every night at the end of a full day of workshops and coming in almost with a new script. What was beautiful in terms of the rehearsal process was just working with Orla. Me and Orla have been friends for a long time. Orla Loughlin is the director of Enough of Him, and again, what a genius. You'll see the production and little things like the way the characters come in and walk around the stage, and she captures the rhythm of the household. She reduces the characterization of each character that we later explore inside the play down to its bare essentials, just in a circular walk around the stage. Everybody going at different paces, everybody carrying themselves in slightly different ways. The combination between Orla Loughlin, the director, and the movement director and the design, etc. It brings it all together in a way that's just beautiful and profound. Again, like I said about Rosie, without somebody like Orla at the helm, leading this ship and inspiring us all, and giving myself the room to keep on testing things, giving the actors room to experiment with things, it would be a different play. It'd be a much lesser play. We've got very similar instincts in terms of what we think theatre should be, and the power of new writing. And that process in the rehearsal room was just, very much me saying, let's test every single line. Let's test every single scene. Let's, try and find the rawest version of the play, so that every single line of the play is absolutely working for the characters and absolutely working for the story. So I imagine we possibly went into the rehearsal room with at least 40 minutes more material than we ended up with when we finally were on the stage. And I've always believed that it's so important as a playwright to not try and make your work director-proof or actor-proof or designer-proof or etc. It's a mistake that I see a lot of young writers, young students make. They over-prescribe inside their script. And actually, the real beauty of writing sometimes is just leaving room for a director to come in and do something magical, or an actor to come in and surprise you with something, or designers to come in. And actually, I feel like when you look at the totality of the production, everybody brought their A game to this and just, took something that obviously I'd been working on for 4 or 5 years at that point, but they just took it to an even, better level, and it's a wonderful thing when it happens like that. The biggest theme that we wanted to explore in the play was trauma, and how going through violent episodes impact us as human beings. How the past informs the present, if to put it more succinctly. We were really interested with exploring how certain tropes have been portrayed over and over again in slavery narratives. The way slavery stories tend to be told, what happens is after a big long battle, in the courtrooms, a judge turns up and says, well, the good guys have won, and all of a sudden everything's okay. And actually we thought it would be much more interesting to explore how actually if you go through brutal episodes in your life, like what was going on in Jamaica in the 18th century, and if you go through a really trying battle in a courtroom just because a judge turns up at the end and says, you're free, you've won, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is okay again. We wanted to explore that with every single character in the play. It felt a little bit like, that title, Enough of Him, was really our attempt to, headline that idea, that theme, that human beings are complicated, and pain's complicated, and trauma's complicated. And even if the story's set in 1770 and they don't have the language of PTSD, we still felt like actually human beings probably haven't changed so much in the last 200 years that there wouldn't still be some kind of post-traumatic effect after experiencing those things.